Your future starts now. It was just past 6 in the morning when David Keller sat on the edge of his bed, his bare feet resting on the cold hardwood floor of his quiet Nashville apartment. The sunrise hadn't yet crept through the blinds, but the birds had already begun their quiet song. For a moment, he stared at the framed photo of his family that stood on the dresser. His late wife, Anna, smiled back at him from the frame, holding their grandson at a picnic 2 summers ago. David was 61, recently retired, and utterly unsure of what to do with the rest of his life. For the past 38 years, he had worked as a project manager in a mid-sized engineering firm. His days were filled with meetings, deadlines, coffee-fueled mornings, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing buildings rise from blueprints. But the office farewell had come and gone. The emails had stopped. The phone had gone quiet. He was no longer Mr. Keller, the guy who gets things done. He was now just David, a man with long mornings and nothing pressing on his calendar. And yet, something stirred in him that morning. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way the light peeked through the blinds, or the memory of a conversation he'd had with his grandson 2 weeks earlier. The boy had asked him, "Grandpa, what do you do now that you don't go to work?" At the time, David had chuckled and waved the question off, but it had stayed with him. What did he do now? He walked slowly into the kitchen, made a pot of coffee, and stared out the window over the sink. Across the street, Mrs. Hunt, his 84-year-old neighbor, was already out tending to her garden, her back slightly bent, her wide-brimmed hat bobbing gently as she worked. She waved when she saw him, and he waved back with a half-smile. A realization crept in. He wasn't done. Life hadn't checked out on him just because he had stopped clocking in. He remembered how, in his 20s, he used to say, "Someday I'll write. Someday I'll travel. Someday I'll learn to play the guitar." But someday never came. Now, at 61, with no deadlines and no morning commute, he realized that someday was today. David took a deep breath, pulled open the hallway closet, and rummaged through a pile of old boxes until he found it, a dusty guitar case. It had been a gift from Anna on his 40th birthday. He'd promised her he'd learn to play, and he'd meant it, but life had a way of swallowing promises whole. He set the guitar down gently on the kitchen table, ran his fingers along the worn surface, and opened the case. The strings were out of tune, and dust coated the wood, but the sight of it awakened something buried in him. He opened his laptop, pulled up a beginner's lesson video, and for the first time in decades, he began to learn something new. By noon, his fingers were sore, and his strumming was clumsy, but he felt alive. That afternoon, he walked to the local bookstore and signed up for a writing group that met every Wednesday evening. He hadn't written a single story yet, but he had ideas. Stories of buildings and people, stories of second chances, stories that might not change the world but could touch someone's heart. The following week, David sat in his first group session, nervous among strangers half his age. He introduced himself simply, "I'm David. I just retired, and I guess I'm starting over." The group welcomed him without judgment. When he read his first story, about a man who finds meaning in rebuilding old guitars, there was a quiet pause before the applause. Later that night, as he walked back home under the amber streetlights, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. A quiet, steady pulse of momentum. He wasn't simply passing time. He was creating again, becoming again. His days slowly began to fill, not with obligations, but with possibility. Mornings started with guitar practice, followed by long walks around the neighborhood where he often stopped to chat with Mrs. Hunt or wave to the mailman. On Thursdays, he volunteered at the local youth center, helping kids with science projects. On Saturdays, he took a photography class at the community college, learning how to see the world through a different lens. One chilly morning in late October, David stood in front of a small audience at a community event downtown, guitar slung over his shoulder. He was shaking, but he smiled. The sign behind him read, "Never too late open mic night." He played a simple melody, nothing fancy, but when he finished, the applause was warm and real. After the show, a woman named Evelyn approached him. She was in her 50s, recently divorced, and confessed she'd always wanted to write poetry but never had the courage. "Your song reminded me that I still can," she said. And that's when it hit him. This new chapter wasn't just about him. By starting now, by trying, learning, showing up, he wasn't just reclaiming his own life. He was lighting the path for others, too. One evening, David sat back in his apartment, sipping tea and reviewing a list of things he had always wanted to do. He smiled. It was no longer a bucket list. It was a blueprint. He hadn't traveled yet, but he had his passport ready. He hadn't written a book, but he had filled a notebook with stories. He hadn't mastered the guitar, but he could play a song well enough to make someone pause and listen. He was still becoming. He was still building. And he knew, without a shred of doubt, that his future was not something waiting down the road. It was already here, unfolding moment by moment, note by note, word by word. And just as the next sunrise loomed beyond the hills of Nashville, David had no intention of standing still. Because the truth was, his story wasn't over. He hadn't yet spoken to his daughter about the idea that had been forming quietly in his mind for the last 2 weeks. A project that had begun with a journal entry, and now lived as a sketch on a napkin and a folder on his desktop titled The Center. It was just an idea for now, but a powerful one. A place where retired men and women could gather to share skills, learn from one another, and rediscover purpose. A community of doers and dreamers who believed that the second half of life might just be the better half. David knew he'd need help, funding, support, maybe a lot of patience. But he also knew he had time, and more importantly, he had the will. And he remembered what Anna used to say to him whenever he hesitated to try something new. "You're not too late. You're right on time." And so, as autumn winds stirred outside and the city lights blinked on across the skyline, David opened a fresh page in his notebook and wrote 6 simple words across the top. "Your future starts now, David Keller." The next morning, David woke up before the sun again, but this time with a feeling that had become familiar. Anticipation. Not the kind of nervous energy he used to feel before quarterly meetings or project launches, but something softer, deeper. A quiet thrill that came from knowing he was moving forward on his own terms. He poured his coffee, sat at the kitchen table with his notebook, and stared at the words he'd written the night before. "Your future starts now, David Keller." He ran his fingers gently over the ink, then turned the page and began outlining his idea more seriously. The center, he decided, would not be another sterile senior facility. It would be a place that pulsed with life. There would be rooms for music and writing, gardens and greenhouses, mentorship programs, and spaces for people to simply talk and remember who they were outside of their job titles or medical histories. A place to begin again, regardless of age. He had never started anything like this before. He wasn't an entrepreneur. He had never written a grant proposal or filed for nonprofit status. But he knew people, and more than that, he knew how to organize. He had spent nearly 4 decades taking vague ideas and turning them into concrete outcomes. Buildings didn't scare him. Bureaucracy didn't scare him. But this dream, this was personal. That same afternoon, he visited his daughter Rachel, who lived just 20 minutes away in East Nashville with her husband and 2 kids. Her home was full of crayons, Legos, and the sound of cartoon voices drifting in from the living room. Rachel greeted him with a warm hug and a raised eyebrow. "You're glowing, Dad. What's going on?" He told her everything, from the guitar to the writing group to the open mic. And then, more carefully, about the center. At first, Rachel was quiet, but her eyes never left his. When he finished, she smiled. "This is amazing, Dad. I think Mom would have loved this." Her words hit him in the chest, tender and true. He hadn't said it out loud yet, but a part of this project, the biggest part, was Anna. She had always been the heart of their community, the one who baked cookies for new neighbors and started the reading hour at the library. The center, he realized, was a way of carrying her legacy forward. Rachel offered to help him put together a presentation for the City Council's community grant program. They had an upcoming session in 3 weeks. 3 weeks to build a pitch, gather support, and refine his vision. The days flew by. David met with retired friends and former colleagues, gauging interest and gathering stories. He spoke with a local church willing to donate and used rooms for pilot programs. He even reconnected with an old college friend, now a lawyer, who agreed to assist pro bono with the legal groundwork. Every conversation added fuel to the fire. But not everything was smooth. Some days the doubts crept back in, like old ghosts whispering you're too late or you don't know what you're doing. On one rainy Tuesday, he nearly scrapped the whole idea after a discouraging meeting with a city official who had politely suggested the project was too ambitious. That night, David sat on the porch with his guitar, plucking at random chords as the rain softened into mist. He thought about giving up, thought about just focusing on his writing, his music, the quiet life he had begun to enjoy. But then he remembered Evelyn, the woman from the open mic, who had found the courage to write poetry because he had shown up. He remembered the look on his grandson's face when he told him he was learning something new. And most of all, he remembered Anna's voice in his head, as real as ever. Right on time, David. The next morning, he got back to work. The day of the city council meeting arrived under a blue sky sharp with autumn wind. David stood in front of a room filled with officials, local leaders, and fellow citizens. His hands shook slightly, but his voice was steady as he spoke. He didn't talk about statistics or funding models at first. He told them about himself, about the silence that followed retirement, the feeling of fading into the background. He spoke of forgotten dreams and the surprising joy of rediscovering them. He told them about Mrs. Hunt, who still gardened at 84, and about the countless others like her. Quiet warriors still holding on to wisdom, stories, and skills the world seemed to overlook. Then he shared his vision, a place not for rest, but for reinvention, where age wasn't the end of the sentence, but a comma before something powerful, where people came not to be cared for, but to care for one another again, to teach, to learn, to begin. When he finished, the room was quiet, but the kind of quiet that comes when something has landed, when people are thinking, truly thinking. A few minutes later, a councilwoman leaned forward and said, "Mr. Keller, we'd like to know how we can help." That night, David drove home in silence, not wanting to break the delicate sense of awe that surrounded him. The center wasn't built yet. The funding wasn't secured. But the door had opened, and he had stepped through. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw a small figure sitting on the steps, his grandson hugging a stack of notebooks. "Grandpa," he said, "can you help me start a story?" David smiled and sat beside him. "Of course," he said, opening the first notebook. "But let's start it like this." And he wrote the first line for him, slowly and with care. "Your future starts now." And that story, like David's, was just beginning. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of purpose and motion. David found himself waking up earlier than ever, not because of habit, but because the energy of what he was building pulled him out of bed like a magnetic force. He had always imagined that at 71 he'd be slowing down, maybe gardening, maybe playing chess in the park, maybe traveling once a year and watching the seasons change from his front porch. What he didn't imagine was running meetings, organizing volunteers, navigating building permits, and holding weekly town hall forums to gather input from seniors across Nashville. But that's exactly what his life had become. The pilot version of the center found its first home inside the old community church near Shelby Park. The building had good bones, a wide-open fellowship hall, and enough small rooms for classes and gatherings. The church board was more than happy to lease the space for a symbolic rent, excited to see it come alive again. David and Rachel brought in folding chairs and second-hand couches. A local artist painted a mural across one of the walls, a vibrant landscape of elder hands planting seeds, guiding young ones, writing books, playing violins. It said what David believed deep down, that growing older didn't mean growing obsolete. It meant becoming a deeper well, full of stories and wisdom ready to be shared. The doors opened quietly one Monday morning in late October. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a small chalkboard sign out front that read, "Come in. Your next chapter starts here." The first week, a handful of people trickled in. There was a former biology professor named Clarence who offered to teach a free nature class every Thursday. A retired nurse named Leah who started a walking group and became the unofficial greeter. And a woman named Dolores who brought her mother, 88-year-old Rita, to the music room every day just to listen and hum. But the name that stuck with David the most that week was Jeremiah. Jeremiah was 67, with deep laugh lines and a quiet voice. He had worked maintenance for the city for 42 years before retiring abruptly when his knees gave out. David noticed him on the second day, sitting in the back of the multipurpose room, just watching. When David approached, Jeremiah said he was just there to see what all the noise was about. David sat beside him. They talked about old jobs, tools, and how silence can feel louder than a jackhammer when you're not used to it. A week later, Jeremiah showed up again, this time with a toolbox. He offered to fix the loose banister by the stairs. The next day, he returned with a small group of other retired workers, each one with something to offer: carpentry, wiring, painting. They made themselves the unofficial facilities team, and suddenly the center wasn't just David's project anymore. It belonged to everyone who stepped inside and left a piece of themselves behind. As word spread, the rooms filled faster. There were storytelling nights and skill-sharing sessions. One of the most popular programs was called Letters to Tomorrow, where members wrote letters to their younger selves or to people they'd never met, sharing advice, hope, and hard-earned lessons. Rachel began compiling them into a digital archive. She said one day they'd publish them as a book, something the world needed. But amid all the growth, David began to feel the familiar tug of fear. The more people believed in this place, the more weight it carried. What if it collapsed? What if funding fell through? What if the city changed its mind, or worse, lost interest? He kept these fears quiet, but they lingered like fog, especially late at night, when the house was still and the shadows of doubt felt too close. Then, one evening, as he was locking up the building, he found a small note tucked into the mailbox. It was written in soft cursive on lined yellow paper. It read, "Dear Mr. Keller, I attended your talk at the council meeting a few months ago. I didn't speak then because I was afraid. I've spent most of my retirement feeling invisible. But I've been watching what you've done with the center, and I came by last Thursday. You probably didn't see me. I sat near the bookshelf and listened to the writing group. I just wanted you to know that for the first time in years, I'm considering that maybe I'm not finished yet. Thank you for reminding me. M." David stood on the front steps of the building, reading that letter 3 times. Then he folded it gently and put it in his breast pocket. That night he didn't sleep, not because of worry, but because his mind was on fire with ideas again. He thought of expanding the music room, of partnering with the local high school so the seniors could mentor students, of building a garden where people could plant their stories, not just vegetables, of launching an intergenerational festival right there in the neighborhood. And he thought of Em, whoever she was, and how many others like her might still be out there, waiting not to be saved but seen. The next morning, David returned to the center early, hours before the doors would open. He walked through each room, running his fingers along the desks and tables and shelves. Everything here had been built out of hope. And hope, he realized, wasn't fragile. It was stubborn. It took root when nothing else would. He sat at the front desk, flipped open his notebook, and began a new entry. We are not finished. This is not the afterthought of life. This is the becoming. Outside, he heard the sound of footsteps. Someone was coming early. He smiled, set down his pen, and stood up to greet them. The story of David Keller and the center was still being written. And just around the corner, something else was about to begin. The footsteps belonged to Dolores and her mother, Rita. It wasn't unusual to see them early, but today they looked different. Dolores had a determined expression, and Rita, always dressed with care, wore a flower in her hair, tucked above her ear like a girl going to a dance. David opened the door wide. "Morning, ladies," he said. "Morning, David," Dolores replied, her voice tight with emotion. "We need your help." They sat in the front lounge near the window, where the light softened the room with that special Tennessee glow, and over 2 cups of weak coffee, Dolores explained. Rita's health was changing. The doctors were saying words that sounded like limits, words like stage and progressive and prepare. But Rita wasn't ready to slow down. She wasn't ready to sit in silence and wait for the end. David turned to the older woman. Her eyes were bright as ever, focused and steady. I don't want pity, she said, as if reading his thoughts. I want to leave something behind. Something that matters. I want to record my stories. David nodded. Then let's start today. That afternoon, he cleared out one of the upstairs offices and turned it into a temporary recording room. With the help of Rachel and a borrowed microphone, they set up what they called the living archive, not just for Rita, but for anyone ready to share what they'd lived. Soon others came. Clarence recorded hours about his field trips into the Smoky Mountains with students. Leah spoke about the early days of nursing during the AIDS crisis. Even Jeremiah, quiet, gruff Jeremiah, told stories of fixing things no one knew were broken, of the secret pride in keeping a city running. Each story felt like planting a seed into the soil of time. David listened to them all, heart open and still, as though collecting fragments of something ancient and precious. But something else was growing, too. Something even David hadn't anticipated. One Wednesday afternoon, a group of high school students from Glenwood Academy came to the center. It had started as a class field trip, arranged by a teacher who had seen a local news segment. But after that first visit, the students kept coming. On their own time, after school, on weekends. They didn't come to volunteer. They came to listen. They sat in on the poetry sessions, the memoir circles, the music hours. They scribbled notes during Clarence's nature classes and helped Leah with the walking group. One student, a shy junior named Jordan, bonded with Jeremiah over tools and began learning basic repairs. It was as if a door had been opened between two worlds that had long forgotten each other. One afternoon, David noticed a small crowd in the multipurpose room. He walked in and saw something that made his throat tighten. Rita was sitting in her favorite chair, her voice barely above a whisper, telling a story about dancing in the street the day World War II ended. Around her sat 5 teenagers, eyes wide, not one of them looking at a phone. He stood at the back, unnoticed, and realized the dream had become something bigger than himself. This wasn't a center anymore. This was a bridge. Later that evening, when the crowd had cleared and the sun was starting to dip low, David sat beside Rita. He said, "You've probably touched more lives here in 2 months than most people do in a lifetime." Rita looked out the window and gave a faint smile. "That's the thing about getting older," she said. "People think we're done growing. But maybe we're just growing deeper roots." That night, David went home and opened his notebook again. He wrote, "We planted a seed. It grew into a garden. And now the children have come, asking for stories to take with them. We are not the end of the line. We are the beginning of a different map." 2 weeks later, the center hosted its first public event. They called it the Echo Festival. It was held outside, on the grass lot behind the building. Rows of white tents flapped in the breeze. Tables were filled with handmade crafts, memoir zines printed by the writing group, watercolor paintings from the art circle, home-baked pies from Leah and her granddaughter. A small stage was set for performances, and the sound of fiddles and laughter filled the air. David watched from the edge of the crowd, overwhelmed. People of every age moved between booths. Teenagers arm-wrestled seniors. Elders taught chess to curious middle schoolers. Stories played on speakers across the grounds. Recordings from the living archive, floating through the afternoon like memories given voice. Rachel found him standing still, eyes wet. "You did it, Dad," she said, wrapping her arm around him. "No," he whispered. "We did." The festival was more than a celebration. It was a promise. Proof that something had shifted. That older wasn't another word for lesser. That age didn't mean fade, it meant shine differently. Like an ember glowing in the dark, ready to light the next fire. And yet, for all the joy of that day, David knew this was only the first chapter. The center had outgrown its pilot space. The lease on the church was running short, and more programs needed more rooms. The dream had expanded, and now it needed walls wide enough to hold it. So the next morning, David made a decision. He would find a permanent home. He drove around East Nashville, eyes sharp for possibilities. He visited empty lots, talked to real estate agents, made notes and sketches. Each building he walked through, he imagined filled with sound. Laughter, footsteps, music, stories. Not echoes of the past, but voices of the present, alive and rising. A week later, he found it. An old school building on Riverside Drive, abandoned for years. Red brick, 2 stories, ivy clinging to the corners. As soon as he stepped through the rusted gates, he knew this was the place. It needed work, serious work, but so had he. So had every person who walked through the center's doors. He looked up at the windows and saw not decay, but potential. Another beginning. And so, once again, David Keller reached for his notebook. He wrote just 3 words. Let's build it. And somewhere, beneath the soft Nashville sky, a new story was getting ready to be born. Winter came early that year, casting Nashville in a quiet hush of gray skies and bare branches. But inside the old schoolhouse on Riverside Drive, there was nothing quiet about what was happening. It was a symphony of purpose. David stood at the edge of the gymnasium-turned-workspace, watching as volunteers moved furniture, painted walls, and rewired ancient lighting. The scent of sawdust mixed with fresh coffee lingered in the air. The building still echoed with the voices of children long gone, but now those echoes blended with the laughter of elders sharing blueprints, giving directions, and humming old tunes as they worked. He had named the new building the Grove. It was Rachel's idea, actually. She said, "Asterisk trees grow stronger in groves. They shield each other, feed each other. They don't thrive alone." Asterisk. David thought back to the beginning of it all, when this journey had started with nothing more than an idea in a notebook and a deep ache for purpose. He could never have imagined it would grow into this. The Grove had rooms for everything now. A performance hall where retired musicians played on Friday nights. A wellness studio where yoga mats were rolled out by knees once stiff with age but now full of movement. A technology room where grandmothers taught other grandmothers how to video call their grandkids. A cafe run by a rotating team of volunteers, many of whom had been told they were too old to work again. And a room at the top of the stairs, David's favorite, called the memory room, where photos and letters and stories were archived and shared like sacred scripture. But the most extraordinary thing wasn't the programs or the building. It was the people. They had come from every corner of the city, drawn by word of mouth, newspaper articles, and social media posts shared by younger generations proud of what their parents and grandparents were building. They came with walkers and wheelchairs, with notebooks and musical instruments, with fears and dreams they thought they'd buried decades ago. And they found each other. Rita still came every week, though her voice had grown soft and her steps slow. She was a legend now, always surrounded by listeners. Jeremiah ran the maintenance crew like clockwork. Leah and Rachel had started a program that paired seniors with expectant mothers who had no family support, making grandmothers out of women who had feared they'd never be called that name again. Even the high school students kept coming. One of them, Jordan, the quiet boy who had fixed sinks with Jeremiah, stood on stage during the Grove's official opening ceremony that spring. David had wanted no fanfare, but Rachel insisted on a celebration. Jordan adjusted the microphone, his hands slightly trembling. "I used to think older people just faded into the background," he said. "I thought their time was over. But when I came here, I met people who were just getting started. People who made me believe that purpose doesn't retire, transforms. And one day, if I'm lucky, I'll be one of them." David wiped his eyes in the front row, surrounded by the people who had carried this dream alongside him. The applause that followed shook the rafters. Afterward, as the sun dipped low behind the building and bathed the red brick in gold, David wandered outside to the community garden. A row of new trees had been planted along the walkway, sugar maples and oaks, each one tagged with the name of a center member who had contributed something lasting. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the old yellow note from M, the one that had changed everything. The corners were worn now, but the words were still clear. "Maybe I'm not finished yet." He turned the paper over and wrote on the back, "Neither are we." He knelt and buried it in the soil at the base of a young tree. Not as a goodbye, as a beginning. Later that night, the Grove held its first intergenerational storytelling circle under lanterns strung between the trees. The air buzzed with warmth. A child sat on the lap of an 80-year-old woman who once ran a newsroom. A former janitor laughed beside a young man studying engineering. And in the center, David listened not as a leader but as a witness. Because the grove no longer needed him to guide it. It had taken on a life of its own. This, he thought, was the future they had built. Not just a place but a movement. Not just an idea but a truth. That life doesn't wind down. It expands. That wisdom doesn't expire. It ignites. And that no matter your age, your story is not over, not yet. There are still hands to hold. Still gardens to grow. Still songs to sing and letters to write. Still mornings to wake to and doors to open. Still bridges to build and fires to tend. Still pages left unturned. David Keller closed his notebook one final time and looked around at the glowing lights of the grove. And with a heart full of peace, he whispered to the night, "We're just getting started."